Hello, Bio! I am in the women's locker room at the gym recording your screencast because I totally forgot about it, and I don't have internet at my house. So I'm at the gym. Here we go. Welcome to the cell theory screencast. Okay, the cell theory is really quite simple, and it's composed of two ideas that you probably already know and understand. The first one we've already covered in class, actually, and it's just that all living things are composed of cells. That is one of the requirements for life. You must be made of cells in order to be alive. The next thing, the next part of the cell theory, is also quite simple, and it's just that all cells come from other cells. Which really begs the question, okay, if all cells come from other cells, where did the first cell come from? But this is going to be a short screencast, so I'm going to punt that question until later on in the year. But this is it. This is the cell theory. All living things are composed of cells, and all cells arise from other cells. And we're going to talk about a few different types of cells, a few different types of organisms in the second part of this screencast. Okay, so here we have the three major types of cells. The first is unicellular, the next is colonial, and the last is multicellular. So, a few examples of unicellular organisms. Well, there are bacteria, and additionally, fungi come as unicellular organisms, and also protists. These should be all words that you've heard before from our discussion or the diagram that I drew, the different forms of life and the evolutionary relationships between the forms of life. But these fall into two broad categories. So bacteria are an example of prokaryotes, and fungi and protists are both examples of eukaryotes. The difference between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that prokaryotes do not have nuclei, and eukaryotes do. Prokaryotes, pro meaning before, karyot meaning kernel, so before the kernel, before the nucleus. Eukaryote, eu meaning true, karyot again meaning kernel. So bacteria don't have nuclei while fungi and protists do. Now I'm going to toss up a few different pictures of some of these unicellular organisms. Okay, so here's our first example right here. This is an example of a bacteria. You'll notice that it has a cell wall, a nucleoid, which is like the nuclear structure. This is where all the DNA, the genetic information of the organism is hanging out because it doesn't have a true nucleus. And then ribosomes, which are protein-making machines inside a cell. Now, prokaryotes don't have membrane-bound organelles. I'm going to write that word down right here. No organelles. Does that mean no? No, just dash through. No organelles. No membrane-bound organelles in a prokaryote. Now, you might not know, well, no, we talked about... When I had you organize life, you had the word organelle, and a bunch of you looked it up. It means little organ. Organelles are basically the structures inside a cell that makes, that they're like the small organs of a cell. They help the cell work and do its job. And a bacteria cell has no true organelles. However, eukaryotes, so fungi and protists, do have true organelles, and we can see some of them in here. These pictures aren't great, actually. This is an example of some yeast cells, so talking about fungi here. These are eukaryotes. And then this is an example of a protist. It's a euglena. This is actually a really fascinating organism. We'll look at them later on in the year. But you'll notice they have green little structures in here, these are actually chloroplast structures, so this organism is doing photosynthesis, but it also can eat stuff. It's got the ability to eat and digest other food as well, so it's what's called a mixotroph. It's performing both photosynthesis and eating things as well. So both these organisms have organelles. Okay, let's move on to multicellular organisms. So, a well-known multicellular organism is a plant and animals. So by definition, both plants and animals are multicellular, and I'm not going to put any pictures of those up because I think you know what plants and animals look like. But we're going to be looking more in the future at cellular structures of plants and animals. We're actually going to be looking at your cells a little bit later on, next week. Next week? This week? Next week. Yes, next week. The last type of organism is a colonial organism, and these are also protists. So, I'm going to throw up a colonial organism here. Oh wait, I want to backtrack for a second and say again that plants and animals are also eukaryotes. So they have a nucleus and they have these membrane-bound organelles. Okay, so here we have Volvox. It is a protist, and actually each little dot that you see right in here, the green dot, is a single cell, and they're attached together by their membranes. And actually inside, these big green blobs are floating. These are big cellular spheres, and they're green because they're performing photosynthesis. And the green little dots in the middle, all these guys, are actually the Volvox babies. So once this organism right here is ready to give birth, it will open up and these little babies will explode out. These are actually fantastically beautiful organisms to look at underneath the microscope. Each little cell has a tail called a flagella coming off of it. So these are actually, they're phototactic. So they will swim towards the light, these orbs. So if you shine a light on one side of a microscope slide, they'll all swim towards it. It's really amazing to watch. They're quite beautiful. But anyway, you might be thinking, what makes a colonial organism different from a multicellular organism? And I'll tell you, the reason is that each of these cells here, each of these green little dots that you see, is exactly identical to all the other green little dots. Whereas a multicellular organism, such as a plant or animal, obviously we have specialized cellular structures that are different from one another. So our heart tissue is different from our skin tissue, which is different from our eye tissue, which is different from our brain tissue. You get the point. So colonial organisms are, again, organisms living together in a colony, but they're all the same. And, again, these are protists, so they fall under the same category as these single-cellular protists, or unicellular protists, so they are also eukaryotes. They have organelles. So, cells are composed of two major things within them. First is organelles. And organelles are membrane-bound. And I'm going to give you the name of an organelle, the rough endoplasmic reticulum. This means nothing to you right now, but it's just an example for you of a membrane-bound organelle. This will make sense a little bit further on in the year, meaning next week. The next thing that composes cells are structures. And these are components of the cell that are not membrane-bound. No. And an example of a structure in a cell would be a ribosome. Again, You probably have never heard this word before. It means nothing to you, but I want you to have heard it because we're going to learn about it next week. Okay, this is it for the cell theory screencast.